a sort of combination of disingenuous and honest Bob Jenrick. I mean, I hesitate to give him too much oxygen, frankly, but I did hear him being interviewed earlier by Nick, and my ears were on stalks. I mean, how can anybody who's held the position of Justice Minister and presided over, I think, an almost existential collapse of our entire criminal justice system, suddenly start trying to take pot shots at the new lot 5 months into the job? Rishi Sunak was told by Alex Chalk, his prisons minister, I think, that releasing prisoners early was absolutely essential, but he didn't do it. And there is one school of thought that suggests, I mean, they were already, of course, releasing prisoners earlier than scheduled, but he was told by Alex Chalk that they'd have to do what the subsequent government did, and they didn't do it. There's a school of thought that suggests one of the main reasons why he called the election early was so that he didn't have to announce the early release scheme that the next government was forced to immediately adopt. And then Jenrick pretending not to understand why participants in the so-called Farage riots this summer were able to be jailed at a time of prison overcrowding. The answer being the same as how any newly convicted criminals are going to prison. You free up the space for the newly convicted by releasing some of the previously convicted a little earlier than scheduled. I'm surprised how cross I am about this, because that level of dishonesty is quite frightening. To think that a senior politician could appear on national radio and speak in such, it's parcel tongue, frankly, to speak in such dishonest and, well, to be generous, to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he's just very, very stupid. But I don't think so. I think it was epic and deliberate dishonesty. To pretend not to understand what an early release scheme is designed to do, i.e. free up prison places for the newly convicted, i.e. participants in the so-called Farage riots this summer, and B, not acknowledge that 14 years of government created precisely the scenario in which not only is that scheme necessary, but also the new Justice Secretary revealing this morning that 14,000 more prison places will not guarantee that we won't run out of space again over the next few years. You can't get a quart into a pint pot, as my old grandmother never used to say. I never met my grandmother, but it's the kind of thing that grandmas say, isn't it? You can't put a quart into a pint pot. If you have got too much stuff and only so much vessel, then some of the stuff is not going to fit in the vessel. But it doesn't really make sense to me. I'm sorry to say that, because I sense that I'm saying it a little bit too often at the moment. You tune in expecting me to make sense of things for you. I can make sense of the political dishonesty. Of course I can. I've written blooming books about it. I can't quite make sense of how they continue to get away with it. But what I can't make sense of is the detail, the granular detail of how on earth this could happen. I know the obvious answers to that question. And I know, to be fair, that COVID will have played a part, that the lockdown and the log jam, whether avoidable or not, and frankly, anything that Boris Johnson was in charge of that turned out bad was probably avoidable. But that ship has sailed, that milk is spilt, whether avoidable or not. Obviously, the huge logjam in our courts is a contributory factor to the shortage of spaces in our prisons, because as the logjam eased, I presume that the levels of the numbers of people making their way to jail became unprecedentedly high in that shorter period of time. But how we could have allowed this to happen, well, and part of the reason, of course, is the client media. So many members of my profession spent that 14 years, particularly the 6 years from 2016 to 2024, particularly the 3 years that Boris Johnson was in Downing Street, just completely derelict duty, doing absolutely no journalism whatsoever, tickling Boris Johnson's toes most days, pretending that everything was absolutely fine when the iceberg was hoving ever closer into view. So that's part of the problem. I've got a brilliant misinformation for you later today, for example, about government stationery that is being misrepresented in an almost criminal fashion, if you pardon the conflation of topics. But it's typical of what happens if you are part of a media that told you Brexit was going to be brilliant, Boris Johnson was a stand-up guy, Liz Truss was an economic genius, and austerity was correctly demanding that ordinary people in Sure Start centres pay the price of epic irresponsibility and mismanagement by some of the richest people or some of the richest bankers in the world. I think it's incredible, right? So, do you want to have a crack at this? Who can tell us? How has the criminal justice system ended up in such a parlous state? How? Because this is supposedly, statistically, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It is supposed to be civilized. We think of ourselves as very much first world, don't we? I think still rightly. How on earth has this been permitted to happen? It can't just be the fact that a supine, sycophantic client media allowed the clowns in the Conservative Party to get away with murder for years. That can't be the only reason. Of course, if we had been doing our job better, and some of us tried, then some of these massive problems that have become clear in recent months may have been smaller or even ameliorated entirely. But I genuinely, I'm not a stupid person. I pay attention to what is going on around me. I sometimes stumble across things I feel I should have known before, like yesterday when we discovered that leaving the European Union meant that assisting people smuggling in Germany, if the destination was the UK, ceased to be a crime. You could call it the Farage loophole, if you like, that actually decriminalised people smuggling in Germany if the destination was the United Kingdom. Another magnificent benefit of Brexit. So there's stuff I miss. There's stuff I don't understand. There's stuff I can stare at forever. What's the analogy we usually use? We usually use the magic eye stuff from the 80s. Do you remember? Those sort of weird optical illusions where you'd stare at a page of a colouring book for, well, hours sometimes and wait for this sort of weird image to emerge, like a steam train or a lion would emerge in the background, somehow hidden in all the fractals and all the patterns. I feel like that about the news sometimes. You stare at it for long enough, then you will make sense of it. The image will emerge. But this is absolutely mad. Absolutely bonkers. And the idea that honest Bob Jenrick pops up today trying to lecture the new government on what... It's a bit like someone turns up in your kitchen and does a poo on the floor and then starts giving you advice on how to clean it up. It's absolutely extraordinary. Robert Jenrick pooing all over the place and then lecturing the owners of the home, the new owners of the home, on why they should be cleaning up his mess and what they should be doing to sanitise the environment that he's polluted with his filth. I truly, it's almost refreshing to have a day like this. You think you're going mad, don't you think? New government, new era, new language, new vocabulary. Up pops honest Bob Jenrick, famous chiefly for painting over murals of cartoon characters in a processing centre for unaccompanied children. And now he's trying as a former Justice Secretary, therefore who bears more responsibility than almost anybody else alive for the mess that the criminal justice system is, waltzing around studios this morning as if he's got the flipping answer. What did you do when you had the actual job, you irredeemable bucket? It's extraordinary what we allow these people to get away with. And nothing's changing, is it? Still getting their toes tickled, still getting patted on their head and sent on their way with a polo mint and good wishes when they should be eviscerated, should be torn to shreds for the audacity of trying to lecture the new lot on what they should be doing to clean up the massive pile of manure that you have covered the country in. Robert Jenrick. Jeez. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Should have had Classic FM on this morning, actually. It would have been better for my blood pressure. But here we are, looking at the prison system and asking this question. How did this happen? I'll tell you something for nothing. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Keir Starmer, Shabana Mahmood, or any current members of the cabinet. What happened? So you are a lawyer. You are I guess a criminal would work, perhaps. A prison officer? I don't know. Would a prison officer even know? Perhaps you're a former Justice Secretary who's made a habit of defecating all over the space and then telling other people how they should be cleaning it up. Maybe you could give me a ring and tell me how this happened on your watch. How has this country, this wealthy, civilised country, managed to create a situation in which we've got more prisoners than prison places? Why didn't they build more? Question mark 0345 6060 Who else has been in touch? It says, you still on the fence then, James? No, I don't. I never know. Do you know? Can you tell which stories are going to ignite my righteous indignation? I can never tell. Sometimes I don't know until about 4 or 5 minutes after 10. I come on air at 10 o'clock. I'm not even sure what I'm going to be talking about. I just start thinking about things, and then, boom, the whole thing explodes. I go high-pitched. That's probably the best indication. I never know which stories it's going to be, but something about that man, that ridiculous human being, accusing others of being out of touch, just sort of, I don't know, it ignited something. But that's not the point today. That's not the question. The question of how Robert Jenrick has permitted to steal a living is one for the ages. The question that we can actually address today is about, very simply, prisons. Prison places. Does it stretch to courts? 1,700 inmates let out earlier than scheduled in England and Wales in September, another 1,200 in October. The new prison strategy will build 4 new prisons and create 6,500 new places. Building new blocks on current prison sites will create the same sort of number. I listen, as a fully paid up member of the liberal elite, there's a large part of me that wonders whether this is actually the answer. David Gauke, a politician who I think has covered himself in glory since being ejected from the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson's rabble, David Gauke speaks today very persuasively about a need for a complete rethink. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that a Labour government might be a little bit more mindful of alternative approaches. But I suppose we come back to the rabid, sycophantic client media, don't we? If they did start trying to be more efficient and deal with the addictions of prolific offenders with specialist courts instead of just locking them up for ever longer sentences, almost like a revolving door at the prison gates, then we would probably improve the overall situation. But the current politicians would get a kicking from the Daily Mail, so they're too scared of doing it. Front pageophobia, which I don't think they suffer from unduly, but they clearly suffer from a bit. So just tell me how. Let's do an idiot's guide. And I will be the idiot, all right? Today, Matthew, I am going to be the idiot. Because I want to know, simple, complicated, detailed, evidential, experience, whatever it is, how have we ended up in such an almighty mess?